This week I'm going to be recycling old surfaces. So I'm going to be doing some pastel drawings on some old pastel drawings, and then I'm going to work on an oil painting on an old oil painted surface. So I know many of you do this anyway. We've all got stacks of material that we don't want to keep, and it's a good way to use things up. But I thought it would be really worth analysing a little bit how you might do it and why you might do it. And I was thinking about how often with paintings, will get to a point where I just can't seem to finish a painting, can't seem to improve it. It gets to a certain point and it's just not working. And actually the best thing to do is start again. And the difference between that and particularly working on an old surface, when you work on an old surface, you get something back. And when I've got stuck with a particular piece of work, I think it's sometimes because nothing's coming back to me from what's going on in the image. I'm trying to think of a solution, but nothing seems to, the silent canvas doesn't speak because it's silent. And I think working on an old surface, actually you get a number of things going on. You are given ideas, inspiration, whatever, in terms of colour, sometimes in terms of texture, and it can be just a very satisfying process, a dialogue between you and the image, and anything that helps you look much more at the image than at your subject, I think, is to be encouraged. So I've got some photographs here, the children on bicycles. I'm going to be working with those images. I've decided I'll do a couple of quick sketches just to talk you through some thoughts on this exercise. And I'm going to work on a couple of old pastels, maybe this one and this one. I've chosen this one because it's very colourful, and I know that it's actually in my subject, the girls on bicycles. There's not a lot of colour, and that'll be quite interesting to try it on something very colourful. Well, there'll be lots of surprises, and something like this which isn't so colourful, which is, pretty sort of limited palette. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I advise you to do, is I'm going to make sure that I thoroughly spray this drawing so that what's there is nicely sealed and will not mix too much with what I do next. So let's pause while that dries. So it's sprayed and I've turned the image on its side. My image is pretty loose, so it's maybe not such a distraction, but I think it can help if your image is a little bit distracting to perhaps turn it upside down or not have it the right way up, so that the old image isn't too much of a distraction. I've sprayed it, and now I'm going to draw with charcoal. And part of the point of what I want to be doing here, I think, is making the most of what will show through from the old drawing, and having, if you like, wrong colours underneath the colours that I'm working with the old colours, the wrong old colours underneath the new right colours, if we can call them those. So in order to find your way first, I think it's helpful to have maybe some charcoal and do a certain number of outlines. So that's just finding your subject. I'll maybe just do the two of them. And this can be tricky initially because, if you like, there's a lot of noise, all this stuff showing through. So you've got to be a little bit patient and confident at the beginning that you can. I'm undecided as to whether I should put them on grass or on the road. I think I'm going to keep them on grass, so we'll just have some different bits of grass. So that can be quite a helpful first stage, is to work with the negative shape of, in this case, the background. So I've drawn out very roughly some of the shapes of my figures, and I'm just introducing some of the background colour. So that's a good, very challenging exercise in negative shapes, because there's all this other stuff shouting. But it means that, you know, in the case of this figure, who will be, I'm expecting to have her dressed in blue, she will actually have a lot of pink in her colour scheme. And what I have to work with, what is the whole point really of this exercise, is looking carefully at what happens, particularly colour-wise, in the case of the drawing. When we get to paintings, it'll also be to do with texture. But to look at what's happening colour-wise between the old image and the new image. This takes a lot of concentration. It's quite difficult to talk and do this as well, but that's what I have to do. So I've gone for a fairly simple single green to start. And then I think I'll just quickly do something to the sky, because I think that will also help make some sense of my image. So I've applied, and it has made a big difference, I think. I'm applying the pastel. So it's pastel over old pastel. And I'm doing it in a fairly loose hatched way, because I want to be able to see through to what's underneath. Now let me do a little bit to some of these figures and their clothing, because that maybe will make a difference. Yes, so I don't want to obliterate what's underneath, otherwise there would be not much point to the exercise. It would be a fairly simple case of just reusing something. I want to get something out of the old surface. So by applying the pastel fairly loosely, I can start to see a combination of old marks and new marks. I always find when I'm drawing figures, it's doing hair and heads can make a big difference to give you a person. So I think that's important for me to do to these ones. So I've got to get it to a certain point before you really see what I'm doing makes sense. And what I'm looking forward to actually is putting on some of the lighter marks, because I don't know if it was obvious to you. It was obvious to me when I started putting on the sky that things really started to stand out. So I'm hoping that as I begin to introduce some, if you like, some patches of light to the clothing, to the hands and faces of my figures, then they'll really begin to stand out, and I can perhaps more confidently make a choice between what I keep of the old painting or the old drawing and what I lose. So let's do that a bit more. Let's get some light onto some hands. So I suppose this does connect quite well with what you were doing. Some of you were doing last week, working with collage, because it's very much about how much you quieten down the background. I mean, for example, if I smudge some of this green, which I'm inclined to do now, it does make it more solid. It dulls it a little bit, but it does quieten down some of the noise that's in the background. But also, just notice here, there was, in that original drawing, there was a little bit of bright yellow. And I think that would be quite nice to introduce a bit more bright yellow, actually, into my background. So I'm giving that as an example of, as you look at your drawing and see what's showing through from the old image, there may be ideas, suggestions about colours that you just like the look of. They've appeared as part of your new palette, and you might think, well, actually, that's good. And I like what she's wearing. She's wearing blue and pink together. So trying to exploit what's given to you from the old drawing and putting it to work in a new piece of work. Right, yes, so I was going to put light on some of them. I thought that would be a thing to do as well. I think this is an activity as well that needs to be done quite slowly, quite carefully, in the sense that you have to really observe what's going on. It could well be happening. It will be happening as you work, and if you're not really attentive, then you'll go past something. Something will happen, and because you're too busy just getting rid of all the old stuff, you won't notice a kind of working together of old and new. So that's one example, and you can see it's beginning to work, and I would like to think that there's more depth to this image because it's not just one layer of the new drawing, the old drawing obliterated and lost, and the new drawing just taking over. I'd like to think that it's got some depth, which is a result of old and new working together. I think because I'm keen on the light, making the light work, I also need to find a solution for the shadows. Note to Doreen, so those are just black shadows, but it's a green surface more or less, so I've got to play around a bit with some greens. Mixing with them with the charcoal is quite helpful, but I don't know, because I've got such a lot of yellow in that grassy colour, I might have to get, I don't know, quite light with that, quite colourful shadows. I'm not sure, I probably should have just tried a bit of yellow in there. Anyway, I certainly would find myself experimenting a bit with shadows, trying to get a balance between the amount of colour in the shadow and the amount of colour in the surface that is the shadow is falling on, and also the temperature. I don't know if I need to warm those shadows up a bit. So I try combinations of colours, and once I find the one that works, then I make it the sort of major one. So that's that example. I'm going to quickly try one other, just so that you can see a bit of variety. So another example, this was my Meadows in the Snow, A Place for Lovers. It was done on blue paper with charcoal and some pale chalk, so I think this time I might try a brown pastel, thinking what's, the brown pastel on the blue surface will probably stand out more quickly and readily. But again, it's the same approach. I'm doing a line drawing just to see where things are going to be, and then I'm going to block in some big areas of negative shape background colour. Another approach, of course, would have been just to block in colours, which probably would have worked, but I find the guide of these outlines, well, very helpful, really. There we go. So let's try. Blocking in some sky. I did that first because it, to my eye, it made such a difference with the last one. And then some of these these greeny browns might do the trick. And there's some yellow. So this obviously is a different example because the colours coming through are much more limited. So it's probably quicker to get a kind of harmony. Is it less interesting? We'll have to see. Certainly going to be putting on some different sorts of blues. So where things end up, colour-wise, I want to be looking to see what's the next step. So I think I'll pause and do a couple of things. So I got some of the main sort of mid-tone colours blocked in, and now I'm just putting some patches of light, which will really make things stand out. So yeah, I think it's a good exercise in working with shapes, perhaps particularly negative shapes, but also here I'm doing some light shapes, and that's helping my subject stand out, my new image stand out from the old. If I were to paint this, I mean, I'm going to do a painted exercise, well, in the same way, but with different background material. But if I were to do a painted exercise, if I were to use this as a study for a painting, well, what would I do? I suppose I might have to prepare a surface with some of the old colours. And, you know, many people, you know, those people who often work with collage will do something similar. They'll prepare a surface with either random colours or selected ones that I might have been informed by if I was to use this, might have been informed by this, but put down in a fairly loose way, so that in painting there could be the same process of a certain amount of discovery as the new image emerges from the old. Anyway, that's probably made those points well enough for approaching drawings. So let me set up to paint. So I'm going to paint on this old seascape. I think I've chosen it. It's not as colourful as the first thing that I did in pastel, but actually I prefer this drawing. I like its limited palette with a few surprises, the blue paper in particular showing through, and so maybe I chose that because of some of the colours in the sky. I've turned it upside down, and as I did with my charcoal, I'm now going to work with some brown black. I've mixed a bit of burnt umber and ultramarine to give me something dark with which to get my subject sketched out. So this is very much about painting in layers, really. I suppose I've done a few things recently which have been working wet in wet and allowing paint to mix on the surface. This is much more about layers, and I suppose two things in particular. Responding to the old layer, the layer of old colours, and seeing if there's something that they could contribute to a new colour scheme, and also by leaving gaps and letting the old colours show through, you are, as I say, painting in layers, and that by painting in layers you create a depth, a physical depth between the new and the old layers, and that's a depth that translates into the image. The image will appear to have more depth to it because of that, I suppose, interaction between the two layers. And I haven't put together the email as I do this yet, but I'm thinking that I'll probably show pictures I'll show some details of Titian, because when you look closely at Titian, you can just see how, particularly the late Titian, you can see how he worked in layers and how I suppose he would have had almost a certain kind of method of doing certain things, painting dark colours first, gradually getting lighter, the light colours getting thicker. But in a way, no one's really surpassed Titian for his kind of loose brushwork and his ability to paint in a kind of paint surprising, exciting marks, which when you stand back, turn into the subject. And I think there's a parallel with this process, that you don't just draw out and fill in, but you're always conscious of how the different layers might be working together. So I'll pause and mix a few colours, and obviously the next thing I'll do is block in some of the background negative shapes. So this time I'm going to block in actually the negative shape of some of the surrounding grass first. And I'm trying to do it in such a way that I do leave gaps. So my aim isn't to obliterate the old painting. I want to make my new image emerge, but not absolutely at the expense of what's in the old one. Because as I did with the pastel, I'm hoping that I can use some of the colours if I see some interesting things happening between new colours and old. And obviously that will be a kind of gradual thing. So it would make sense, I think, not to block in absolutely, just maybe to help the image appear, the new image, but also leave quite a few gaps so that the things that could be suggested to you can still do that. Don't be in a hurry to get rid of the old image too quickly. And partly based on what came out of the pastel mixing, I've made a couple of colours. So I'm working really between three things. I've got my photograph with the original subjects. I've got my pastel drawing, which was done on a different surface. And then I've got the new painting. And I've got the old painting, that's what I meant to say. So I'm trying to work a bit between these three things. And I'm applying paint to the background with a brush. Pre-mixed colours that are mainly informed by the pastel work. That's quite interesting. That's starting to look like an evening sky. You see, I could change tack and paint an evening cycling ride, but I won't. I've also mixed, as well as the sort of turquoise, pale turquoise colour I had in the past, I've also mixed something that's a bit like the sugar paper that this all started on. Remember, that was the meadows in snow. So a lot of this is, in a way, it's provisional, because I don't know what I'm going to keep. Do I keep some of the orange of the seascape, because that's contributing something, or do I gradually calm it down? Do I make it a bit lighter? It's a little bit lighter where there was white in the pastel. So that I've used a brush, and I've blocked in such a way that I've left gaps because I want to respond to the old painting, and I also want there to be depth. I'm going to mix some more colour now, and this time I'm going to use card to block in the figures. With my most recent painting demonstration, I was blocking in darker areas with a brush and then putting in the light with a piece of card. But I thought I'd use card for all of painting the figures, partly because the extra sort of dimension that we get with using an old painting, something that you don't get so much when you're working on a pastel drawing, is texture. So the surface of this old oil painting, the seascape, is fairly textured from the application of paint for that original image. And if you work with the brush, especially if your paint is fairly fluid, then it can be easy to quite quickly sort of obliterate what's underneath. And that's something that I'm encouraging you not to do, not too quickly. But when you apply paint with card, it's harder to cover things quite so quickly. So for that reason, I think it's worth me at least using card for this stage. So I'm working, so generally do from dark to light, and referring to, well, for colour mixing, referring to both my pastel drawing and the photograph, and getting various areas covered. I work mainly with the figure of Inez, and I should also, of course, be stopping all the time, really to take stock of what's happening, what's working, what's going on between the two layers. Oh, it's funny, I mean, these lines, they were the sky, but they're looking a bit like a kind of fence. I could possibly even respond to that and say, right, I want to include that as part of my composition. I don't think I've got the head for it. painting and talking and try to manage the old and the new is challenging me enough. But that could be an example of something to pick up on, something given by the old painting. Okay, so I've done quite a few of the mid-tone colours there, and now I'm going to try some of the lighter colours. To see how things stand out. And actually there are parts of I've got this brown, I suppose it's the beach. It's the beach and the seascape, which is actually not so far from some of these colours I'm putting on for light on the skin. So because of that, it's probably the blue that will make more of an impact. So that's helping that figure stand out. But I am anxious to demonstrate to you the purpose of this working in layers and give some good examples of what I would take from the old painting and incorporate into the new painting. And that could include, if there are colours showing through that I think are significant, then I can mix those colours and use them positively, introduce them back into the painting. So I think that's probably as far as I need to go, because I don't want to go on too long, but I think that's hopefully demonstrated the process, using an old drawing, turning it upside down, maybe fixing it extra strongly before you put new pastel on top, and then seeing about working on an old painting. I've ended up choosing something that's not very colourful. The one that I worked on, I found it quite exciting doing this one. It's very colourful, but actually I'm more at home with this slightly more limited palette. And I think what I would go on and do, I would adapt some of this browny orange into the sky so that it's not quite so dark. And I would probably make some more of this blue-grey, which was part of the sky of the old painting, and bring it back into some of the grass and the landscape. Because I like what that does. I can't explain what it is, but I like the effect it has on the colours. So in a way, it's all slightly more mellow, more limited, but I hope it's got a depth that comes from the layers of the old painting and the new painting. The colours given by the old painting, but also the texture. Okay, so look forward to seeing some of your ideas, and perhaps you might have tried a sketch on an old drawing as a starting point for us to look at on Monday. Cheerio.